Welcome back, everybody. In this series of short lectures, we will talk about the indigenous faiths very broadly of North America and Africa. So the first place to begin is, what does that word indigenous mean? Well, as we can see, the word indigenous means originating or occurring naturally in a particular place, native, characteristic of a particular region. So, in other words, if we take this, say, for example, and put it in context of biology, each ecosystem, the different continents, they have plants that are indigenous to that continent. In other words, they occur naturally, they originated there on that continent, they're native there, right? They're associated with that particular region. So this is also true with religions. There's indigenous faiths throughout the world. So in other words, it's not just North America, Africa, but Asia, Australia, Europe, all the different continents have their own indigenous religions. So a lot of students, when they say, "Oh wow, Mr. K, this is really cool," so we're going to kind of spend lots of time learning about all the different indigenous faiths of these two continents, and the answer we just can't. So the answer is no. And people say, "Well, why is that, Mr. K?" And the reason why is that there's hundreds of indigenous faiths in North America alone. Not too many people realize that. And in Africa, literally, there's thousands of different indigenous faiths. So when people hear that, they go, "Wow, I didn't know that." Well, what happens to indigenous faiths? Why didn't I know all this? Now, what happens is that when we have an advanced culture, right, that comes into contact with an indigenous population, right? So in other words, indigenous population, they're going to have their own religion, their own faith, right? And this culture is more advanced than this one. So then, there's two different things that can happen. One thing that can happen is the indigenous faith is wiped out. So in other words, when the advanced culture comes, right, these people have their own religion, their own faith. So then they come into contact with these people who are more primitive, this native population, and then the faith of the people that are not as technologically advanced is just, right? So in other words, the advanced culture says, "Hey, you've got to believe in what we believe. You have to start following our religion," right? And this is what happened. You could probably think of the example that I'm thinking of right now, is that when the settlers came to the New World and they started to Christianize the different indigenous populations as they came into contact with them. And the indigenous people really didn't have, too much of a choice. They were just, that's just that. And then they stopped practicing their rituals. They stopped telling their myths. They stopped, and then what happened to that faith that they had been practicing for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years? It's gone. It just gets wiped out, usually in the course of a generation. The second thing that can happen to indigenous religions, number 2, become assimilated into the religion, and by that we mean the religion of this advanced culture. And you might know of the example that I'm thinking of here as well. A lot of Christians today, every so often, usually about Christmas time or Easter, they stop and think, "Why do we have a Christmas tree? There's not a Christmas tree in the New Testament. Why do we have Easter eggs? there's not Easter eggs in the New Testament, right? Those are good questions to ask. And the reason is, as different indigenous populations were Christianized, they became assimilated, right, into Christianity, taken in, and they kept little pieces of their culture, little pieces of the practices of their indigenous religion. So then they kind of became little smaller parts of the broader faith of the advanced culture. And then, of course, not all indigenous religions had this happen. There's still some indigenous faiths, especially in Africa as well as in South America, that haven't come into contact with the outside world, which is a really cool thing to think about, that are still, in their pristine form that they were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years ago. So, when we talk about the indigenous faiths of North America and Africa, it's important to remember that the diversity is simply amazing. And also, these are not relics. In other words, these are not things that you're going to find in a museum. There's people today, especially with the assimilation, that say, for example, they might be Muslim or they might be Christian, but they still retain different rituals that can be linked back to the indigenous past of that faith before the advanced culture came. So we're getting close to the 10-minute mark, so we'll pick up with the next lecture.